I'm hiring Jean as my hype man from here on out. Just every room I enter, she's going to come in first and just prime everybody about how awesome I am. Because I'm going to need to hear that about 97 times, I think, to believe it. So I just wanted to thank you all for having me. It's funny that you call this a soft subject, since we will be talking a lot about rocks. And I wanted to say just how fitting it is that we're able to talk about William Edmondson here now, because we're very close to where he lived and worked, but also because, thanks to Angela's research, we now know that his father was one of the men who built Fort Negley. So this is a very meaningful spot for Edmondson. All right. So William Edmondson was the first African-American artist to have a solo show at the Museum of Modern Art. The value of his work has skyrocketed recently, and this statue, the boxer, sold at auction for over $750,000 in 2016. Yeah. Christie's is doing some fun revisionist history here, and I wanted to tell you about it because I think it gives us a glimpse of Edmondson that we don't really otherwise get to see. The boxer is one of the sculptures that Edmondson made while he was working for the WPA. In true fact, his boss at the WPA was that terrible racist Jack Kershaw, who now is probably best known for having been the sculptor of the Nathan Bedford Forrest statue that was outside. Yeah, him. He was also well known in the 60s because he was briefly James Earl Ray's lawyer. He started the League of the South, just a real charmer, Jack Kershaw. Anyway, so the story goes that Edmondson brought this sculpture into work to show it to Kershaw, and Kershaw said it was good and asked Edmondson what it was called. And Edmondson answered, Jack Johnson, not Joe Louis. So why the name switch? Well, first, Christie's probably thinks that this is an honest mistake. It can't be Jack Johnson because the statue has hair and Jack Johnson, famously, does not. And second, though, I doubt they know that Edmondson was talking to a proud and vocal white supremacist and told him that the statue's name was Jack Johnson. Because if they had, they might have realized how Edmondson was having a joke at Kershaw's expense, saying in essence, here's a statue of a black man with more athletic talent than most white men, carved by a black man with more talent than you. And if Kershaw had realized he was being joked on, Edmondson had plausible deniability. His brother-in-law, Jack Johnson, was briefly famous in Nashville for fighting a cop. I also didn't have room for putting it in here, but Jack was also infamous. This is the second time he made the front page of the paper. A few years earlier, he got drunk and shot his hand off. So this fight that he was having with the police officer, literally doing it one-handed. So I think Jack was quite a character. But a lot of the stories you're going to hear about Edmondson out in the world are going to frame him as a sweet but dumb religious fanatic. If you leave here with any knowledge about Edmondson today, let it be that he was funny and deeply thoughtful. So just to give you a brief rundown on William Edmondson, he was born December 1874 on the Felix Compton farm, which we are all sadly very familiar with now because that land is currently the site of Covenant Presbyterian Church. Yeah. William's parents, Orange Edmondson and Jane Brown Edmondson, were enslaved at birth, but it's not clear if they were enslaved by the Compton family or if Orange came up from an Edmondson property. The family were sharecroppers on the Compton farm until Orange died, and then they moved into Edgefield here, or Edge Hill, sorry, yeah, I get my edges confused, Edge Hill here, a neighborhood near the fort that Orange helped build. William worked for the railroad and then as a janitor, and he owned a home at 1434 14th Avenue South. And the trees that stood in front of his front entrance are still there. You can go by and see them. It's pretty cool. He lived there with his sister, Sarah, and many of his brothers and sisters lived nearby, and nephews and nieces were constantly in and out of his house. He didn't start sculpting until he was an old man. So now we're going to take a brief digression into the White Edmondson / Edmonstons, in case their history gives us any insight into William's history. So the White Edmondsons came to Middle Tennessee in the late 1700s and settled on farms that stretched from roughly Arrington in the south to Harding Place up here in Nashville to the north. William was a very common name in the family. And there are two main branches of the White Edmondsons that seem to intertwine with William's life. First are the Beechville Edmondsons. Beechville was a small rural community just south of where Old Hickory Boulevard crosses Hillsborough Pike. Samuel Edmondson was one of the earliest settlers and in the community, and family lore has a William Edmondson living nearby at what is now 1929 Old Hickory Boulevard before the Civil War. I got a picture of the house, but looking at it more closely on Google, I think that that's just actually a replica. I think it looks on Google Maps more like from the 1970s and 80s. But the fence is certainly period appropriate. We know from records here at Fort Negley that a man named Orange Edmondson, who worked on the fort, had been enslaved by William Edmondson and died constructing the fort. We know this can't be William's dad because William wasn't born until a decade later, but Orange isn't a common name, so could this be William's grandfather? All the Orange Edmondsons we know of are related to William, his father, his brother, and his nephew. So it seems plausible that this Orange who died here during the Civil War was also related to William. Dr. Angela Sutton gave me the names of all of the fortifications workers who were listed as being enslaved by the white William Edmondson: Joe, Jordan, Purcell, Richard, and the aforementioned Orange. Were these William's uncles, cousins? We don't know, but the possibility is really fascinating. The other white branch of the family that we should be interested in are the Edmondson Pike Edmondsons. In this case specifically, Miss Willie, note the name, Davis, who owned the land where Edmondson Pike intersects with Nolensville Road. In 1944, she gave the land that was already in use as a black cemetery to the black community of Lake Providence. And I think I can show you with my little pointer. I made this. That's where this cemetery is, kind of back behind a bunch of stuff and not easy to get into. Blah, blah, blah. She made Alfred Whitlow, Delbert Whitlow, and Moses Goyne trustees, and this cemetery was called Edmondson Cemetery. With two glaring exceptions, there are no known ties to the Edmondsons buried in this cemetery and William's family. We'll get to the known exceptions here in a second. But first, let's talk about Micaiah, sometimes known as Keijer Edmondson, born in 1825. Among his many children are a William, about a decade older than our William, a Sarah, our William also had a sister named Sarah, and a son with a color name, in this case, Green Edmondson. He also had a grandson named Brown Edmondson, right? Is this a coincidence? Or I speculate it may have been a way for people to find each other, even if they'd been separated. I read in one of the WPA interviews with enslaved people of a woman who named all of her daughters Estelle because she wanted them to know when they met each other that they belonged to each other, even though they were all sold away from her. So, which is really hard to think about having to make those calculations as a mother. But this was sadly a normal part of the tragedy of slavery. Okay, now for the two glaring exceptions. Alfred and Delbert Whitlow, who were named the trustees of the cemetery, were William's cousins on his mom's side. I don't believe the Whitlows would have ever been trustees of the cemetery if their loved ones weren't in there, if their families weren't in there. But I haven't been able to connect these two Black Edmondson families. Mary Alice here was the wife of Alfred Whitlow, and William carved this headstone for Mary Alice, and it was placed in the Edmondson Cemetery. After a spate of massive and destructive vandalism, the cemetery trustees voted to remove the headstones from the cemetery, and right now I think there are probably only 3 or 4 still in there. The Whitlows then donated this stone to Cheekwood for safekeeping, and if you're ever able to examine it carefully in person, you can see the remnants of red paint from the vandals. There are only 2 other cemeteries we know of that only have one Edmondson in them. Usually a cemetery with an Edmondson has multiple Edmondsons, so it's a real possibility that there were more in this cemetery that are now lost. Then the main drawback we have to knowing a lot about William Edmondson is that the people who interviewed him while he was alive were all, to my knowledge, white people. Edmondson died in 1951, meaning he spent his whole life in the Jim Crow South, where Black men, seeming docile and overly religious and deferential and not proud, was a matter of life and death. It is incredibly unlikely that William would have, or even could have, been frank with the white reporters. And these white reporters had their own projections and biases that shaped their stories. Take, for instance, the idea that William was illiterate. I've seen variations on a quote from Edmondson where he says something along the lines of, "I can't read," or "I can't read too well." And okay, that sure sounds like he's saying he can't read. But then I found the whole quote, and he follows up with the information that he's lost his glasses. Right, and "I can't read too well because I don't have my glasses" is just a whole different thing than "I can't read." I do believe that William had some kind of reading troubles. He often carved letters backwards, for instance, and he didn't seem to really care about word spacing, as you'll see in many of the... But the more important evidence comes from the fact that William was deeply, deeply religious and very much wanted to be a preacher. This is just one of the carvings of preachers that he made. He was a member of the United Primitive Baptist Church, and in his church at the time, in order to be a preacher, you had to be able to read aloud from the Bible in front of the congregation. And William was never able to do so to the congregation's standards. But when you consider how much he wanted to be a preacher, in fact, he felt called by God to be a preacher, he was so committed to trying. So if all that was standing in his way was learning to read, he would have done it. So I think that he clearly could read and write to some extent, but I also think that he had some troubles with that practice alone couldn't fix, and that if he were alive today, he'd be diagnosed with something like dyslexia or some other kind of disorder that you just, can't overcome by sheer force of will. This is one of Edwin Weston's pictures of William's yard, showing the scope of the work that William did. Figures of people, animals, gravestones, angels, carvings with biblical meanings. You can also see how his critters were designed to sit on top of gravestones. And though there aren't any left in cemeteries that I've seen today, most of the critters, as we'll see as we look at more gravestones, these are just all dry stacked. So you could go in, pick a gravestone, then pick the little thing that you wanted to have sitting on top. It was kind of all mix and match. So as much as William is known as an artist today, during his life, his most meaningful work was probably providing headstones for people in his community who needed them. So he used actually a lot of different, like a lot of construction debris. I am positive, just based on experiments that I've done, that he was pulling stone out of what's now Rose Park. It was a quarry when he was alive. And certainly as a kid, he would have been, or as a young person over here, could have been some of these stones. So you'll see that a lot of the stuff, like the shape of it, is dictated by the piece of stone that he had. But this and this are what we're going to focus on next. So I have hunted down most of the headstones still out in Middle Tennessee cemeteries, and I think it's possible that there may still be a few more out there. I see things in the yard that I haven't seen in real life, though not very many of them. But by and large, with one exception that I know of, William's headstones ended up in benevolent cemeteries, and they marked the graves of family and friends of William's family and friends. The more rural cemeteries also map onto land held by white Edmondsons, meaning that it's likely that many of the people in the cemeteries had been enslaved by white Edmondsons, and so had come to be in a broad community of people owned by the broader Edmondson family that stretched over southern Davidson and northern Williamson County. Now, one of the reasons that William is considered an outsider artist is because he appears to have not been influenced by any artists that came before him, and supposedly he influenced no artists that came after him. But we're lucky enough to live in a city full of Edmondsons out in the context he meant for them to be seen in. So we can go see where he put them and see that that isn't a true statement. In Greenwood Cemetery, for instance, and I hope that this is obvious, but you can see this shape in a stone that was there when Edmondson was alive, and then right within eyeshot, his take on that very same distinctive shape. So he was clearly influenced by that carver, as well as the carvers of other stones in black cemeteries. It's actually a lot of fun to wander around Cheekwood and try to guess, like, oh, is that an Edmondson? And then you look at it and you're like, oh, no, that's too old. This must be something he saw. Because I'm a corny nerd, you guys. And we know that Edmondson influenced others because we can see their work in our cemeteries as well. We don't know who carved these stones, but we know they were carved after William died. The one on the left is in a cemetery with Edmondsons, and the one in the right is for a woman whose family members in nearby cemeteries had Edmondsons. The idea that William was some kind of disconnected rube, perhaps with savant syndrome, who just happened upon sculpting with no influence from the outside world, also serves to downplay the unexpected connections William had outside of the black community. So let's start with these sculptures. William carved at least 3 depictions of Christ on the cross. Why? Most of the Edmondson scholars barely give this a thought. Depictions of Christ are very popular in Christianity, and Edmondson was a deeply Christian artist. Ergo, of course, he'd depict Jesus. But Edmondson was a primitive Baptist. As a Protestant, he wouldn't have placed much importance on the depiction of the crucifixion. In Protestant churches, if there is a cross hanging in the church, it's almost always empty. And primitive Baptists aren't a monolith, but it's likely there wasn't even an empty cross in his church. So it seems meaningful that William came back to this imagery at least 3 times. And what might that meaning be? Like, what was he getting from it? So enter Angelo Formosa, an Italian immigrant who pulled a grocery cart through Nashville until he saved up enough money to buy a horse. You Nashville old-timers probably recognize the name. The Formosas are still in the grocery game. And the Formosa family at one time had the most privately held Edmondsons. In fact, they may still. Angelo and his family lived on Grand Avenue, just a few blocks from William's home. And when the Formosas moved out to Hillsborough Pike, very near to where William grew up. William built a stone wall around that property for them that still stands. Anybody who's been to Green Hills probably driven by that wall. I know I had, and then I was shocked to discover that's what that was. But I want you to think about that for a minute, what it says about both William and Angelo, that they had a long, mutually beneficial acquaintanceship/friendship. William may not have traveled much, but he knew a guy from Italy. Not only that, but it goes without saying that Angelo would have been very familiar with crucifixes. Does this mean that William was in his house and saw them? Or did Angelo share one with him? Did they talk about spiritual matters together? We don't know, but it seems like this might be a really fruitful avenue of investigation. Oh, stop. Okay, before we get started, I want to tell you that this is Sidney Hirsch. He is a character. He apparently had to leave Nashville because he was too handsome. And I just wanted to warn you, I don't know what happens if you gaze upon someone too handsome for Nashville, but please be careful as you gaze upon his picture. If cause you to run around town or something, I'm not sure. And then this is him as an older man, I guess when he came back to Nashville when we were ready for his handsomeness. I love him so much. He's just So the other unexpected connection to William was with Sidney Hirsch. The story of Hirsch's life is extraordinary, and I'm not sure how much of it is true. Supposedly, he studied all kinds of occult traditions in Asia when he was in the Navy, captaining a whaling ship in China, which maybe my knowledge of Chinese geography is lacking some, but I wasn't aware of any inland whales. That I didn't even know the Navy had whaling ships. So we're just, Sydney's gonna teach us all kinds of stuff we didn't know, y'all. So after he came back and he was too handsome for Nashville, supposedly he went to Paris and became a model for Rodin. And I haven't been able to confirm that, but I do know that he was a minor playwright and a member of the Fugitives, and that he did live near Peabody, which put him near William. Cheekwood describes what happens. Peabody professor, I'm not sure that's even true, but Sidney Hirsch often walked past Edmondson's home due to its proximity to the college. Hirsch admired his work, and Hirsch then introduced Edmondson to Alfred and Elizabeth Starr. This is actually, you shouldn't have given me a pointer, it's too much power, but that's Alfred Starr there. And the Starrs were well-connected art lovers and harped about his work to their friend Louise Dahl Wolfe, a New York photographer for Harper's Bazaar. Dahl Wolfe purchased works and took images of the artist. And it was Dahl Wolfe that shared Edmondson's work with her friends in New York, including at MoMA. So she is directly responsible. I don't know if I should just trigger warning for, oh, we went too far, for tiny stone penis. Someone needs to do a ton of research to nail down what of Hirsch's story is true and what is legend. But I think we can at least say with certainty that he was a gay Jewish playwright with a deep, abiding interest in mysticism, who was a huge supporter of William's. Reclining Man, a sculpture in Cheekwood's collection, was donated by Sidney's lover, Michael Lebec, and experts agree that the sculpture is of Hirsch. So that's why I included, and you can see, you know, not from this angle, but would be a different kind of talk, y'all, if we could make a one-to-one comparison. Probably get us kicked out. This is striking to think about, though. A black man making a nude sculpture of a white man in the 1940s in the South. And the level of trust between the two for William to have then given that to Sidney is almost incomprehensible. The fact that this statue exists is mind-boggling, and we haven't even looked at the back yet. No one seems to have any idea what these symbols mean. This is further complicated by the fact that if Sidney was deeply versed in mystical traditions and theosophy, as he claims, he may have made up personal meanings for these symbols that had were deeply meaningful to him, but completely incomprehensible to the rest of us. At the least, William must have thought that these symbols would have meaning to him. So there'd been, some talk, I would assume. And I bring up Angelo Formosa and Sidney Hirsch because I think what William's artistic response to knowing them tells us is that William was having these mystical experiences himself, visions given to him by God of what he should sculpt, what he should do with his life. And he was also striving to understand them and trying to understand them by making art of things his friends with different religious perspectives found transcendent themselves. Which just, again, mind-blowing and more complicated than just, simple guy. And last but not least, I wanted to circle back around to the headstones and the issues with them. This ram is in the Tennessee State Museum. And though they wouldn't give me the exact numbers, they said they know it's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Here's a picture Louise Dahl Wolfe took of William working on a similar ram on a headstone. And here's the sculpture from that photo in present day in a cemetery in Davidson County, right next to a used car lot. Right? Amantha Lanham's headstone is unique in a lot of ways. It's not in a cemetery that either is or used to be a benevolent society cemetery. It's actually in a Sons of Ham cemetery. So similar types of group, but not the same. Also, Amantha had no ties to William's neighborhood or to any Edmondson plantation. She did, however, live on Chicken Run Road, where it joined with Murfreesboro Pike. Chicken Run Road is now known as Elm Hill Pike. In other words, she lived right across the way from Mount Ararat Cemetery, where William's family was buried and later William would be buried, and where multiple Edmondson tombstones are located. She was a laundress. In every census I could find her in, she was a widow, but in every census she had more children, so she may have had other ways of making money. Her first child was born when she was 14, and she went on to have at least 7 more children. Her one daughter, Tenny, was a domestic. Another daughter, Mary, had a son, but he died in 1965. I found no family information on the rest of the children. So who owns this ram? The law says the family does, but Amantha was born in 1874, and how many descendants might a person have in 150 years? And they'd all have equal say, so we'd have to find them all. And we have no leads. Sure, preservation work could be done without consulting them, though I am, let me be clear, of the opinion that that is illegal unless you are working with the cemetery. But who among us can afford to accidentally ruin a piece of art worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that we don't have permission to touch in the first place? The situation is kind of depressing, but it's also kind of wonderful. We have this problem of how to preserve these important works of art owned by people we can't find, precisely because Edmondson was making art for marginalized people. He wanted his family and friends and neighbors and this one washerwoman to have something beautiful to memorialize them. And keep in mind, his show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York was in 1937. So every gravestone you see with a date after that was made by the first African American to have a solo show there. Black people in Nashville might not have known exactly what was such a big deal about MoMA, but they would have known it was something. And to have that artist make a headstone for their loved ones was a big deal. So we've talked a lot today about the things that William did that we could see as subverting the status quo of his time. But I just, as my ending, want to stress that the value he placed on the well-being of his community has to be one of the most subversive. So, thank you all for having me. I'm happy to answer questions, or we can go back and look at slides if there are. Yes, ma'am?
Should I mention the cemetery where I think there's one?
Yes, please.
Is there one at the Jewish cemetery?
Oh.
Where?
At the Jewish cemetery, I do not know.
I don't think, I don't know of it.
Well, there was a family there that collected art.
Huh. Well,
and
that would.
It's an unusual looking carving.
We will have to.
Ask. I'm doing a cemetery tour of the Jewish cemetery on Sunday.
Oh, nice.
So I will ask.
Excellent. Great. And then please let me know, because that's very exciting.
Where at Cheekwood are these tombstones?
The Cheekwood has a number of sculptures. I think they only have the one tombstone. Many of the stuff, like when I've been there to see it, it's just been in the attic. You've had to like have special permission. Sarah, you saw some recently.
So currently, there are 4 pieces that are on display. 4 pieces that are on display in what would have been Leslie Cheek Jr.'s study. It's on the 2nd floor. When you come up the staircase or up the elevator, you can go, there's like the big gallery space to the right when you come up there, and then there's one room with like a balcony, a big glassed-in area overlooking the valley on to the left of that space. If you go towards that room and then back around to connect to the other half of the building, there's a little nook. You have to go to it particularly. And it's the corner, like his corner office. It is preserved exactly. The squirrel, the ram, girl in a coat, and an eagle are currently hanging out there. And I went and talked to them last week, and it was beautiful. It was a real nice experience.
And then I happen to know, because I just had to give the New York Review of Books some photos for this, that the exhibit that had been at Cheekwood 2 years ago is at the McClurg Museum over in Knoxville. McClug, thank you. McClung, yes. Starting, I think, in 2 weeks.
Yeah, because Cheekwood occasionally does do like a retrospective, and they've got 28, 30.
Yeah, they've got the largest
somewhere,
museum collection.
Yeah, somewhere in the double digits of things, and they have everything from like little tiny things to slabs that he started and didn't finish, and if anything in between. Like, yeah, it's really, really cool. They've done at least 2 since I've lived here, 2 big retrospective shows, and they're always worth it. Actually, the first thing when I moved here, that's what I learned about William Edmondson one of the first 2 years of me moving here, because I was like, who is this guy? This is amazing. So yeah, Cheekwood's a great place to go see, and I think those are on permanent display. And they just, up in this little corner library, you kind of have to seek it out. Like, it's not going to be listed amongst whatever the exhibition is happening. So just know, and if you need to ask a docent, I want to see the office, Leslie Cheek's office where the Edmondsons are, they can direct you over there.
Thank you.
I found the office is at the end. If you go through the exhibit that's on display, you end up there.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, you can't. Some people don't go all the way through, and there's another main hallway that'll take you to the big exhibit space, and you can end up skipping it accidentally.
Yeah, and I'll just say, just to give more props and well-deserved props to Cheekwood, if not for them, we just would not have Edmondson as we know him now. They just have done a great job, both in terms of preserving. I mean, you saw like with the Whitlow headstone, that family, once they were like, wow, this isn't safe in the cemetery, they didn't have anything, like, you're going to bring that home, And so Cheekwood really has stepped up, and that they have stuff that's not quite complete, you know, they really recognized very early on we should take whatever we can get our hands on. And so we're very lucky now. Ma'am?
I want to just comment on the exhibit that they did, like, it was at COVID time.
Mm-hmm.
And that exhibit was very unusual in that, because we've had other exhibits at Cheekwood of the Edmondson. Well, that time, they sent all their stuff over to Fisk University and exhibited there. And the exhibit that was at Cheekwood was borrowed stuff from other, you know, private collections or other collections and stuff.
Yeah.
So it was very unique that those of us that had seen the Edmondson stuff from Cheekwood many times.
Right, yeah, to get
got
it.
to see something new.
Yeah, yeah.
Did Edmondson understand that if things sat out, they were going to dissolve? The limestone would dissolve? Did he carve things deeper that were going to be outside than inside? Did he recognize that this was going to happen quickly?
I don't think he could have predicted acid rain, you know,
But it doesn't have to be
but
acid.
but I'm certain that he was aware that these were impermanent. One thing to keep in mind is just that gravestones in a southern black cemetery are a relatively new invention anyway. A lot of the benevolent cemeteries, the reason that the Benevolent Society said, we want that plot of land right there, is because they knew that those were old slave cemeteries and they wanted to preserve them, and then they wanted to be buried with their families who were in those cemeteries. A great example, there's two. There's a benevolent cemetery up in, I think it's either northern Wilson or southern, and now of course the name is going to slip me, but it's a benevolent cemetery with many different styles of burial. So you can see all the different ways that graves are marked in black cemeteries, even without headstones. Another great one is the Bryanttown Cemetery, which is out Elm Hill Pike towards 440, which looks like a forest until you start to walk into the woods and you realize, like, oh, these trees are marking graves, or those plants are marking graves. So there's many, like, so for a lot of these folks, just even having a headstone that would last 10 years was new, was not something that they would have expected for themselves or their loved ones. And I will say, like, surprisingly, the stuff that I've seen is mostly damaged by, like, moss. And a really interesting thing that I found is you can almost always tell an Edmondson at a distance because a specific kind of gold-colored moss grows on them. So you're just looking through the graveyard, you're like, okay, I gotta go check that one. Better go check that one. Which, you know, again, like, I find really fascinating because it's like, was that something in his yard? Like a moss in his yard that then all of the stones have, no matter now where they are in the world. Also makes you wonder about, like, we clean those stones to preserve them, but should we maybe, like, talk to somebody about what information they might be able to get from those plants before we scrape them off? There's so much really interesting stuff about those stones that I think, like, we just kind of don't know yet. Ma'am?
Was he able to get a living out of this? And if so, how much did he get for a gravestone?
Oh, no. He made the bulk of his money, like I would say most lower and middle class Nashvillians did at that time, from the railroad. And then he was injured while he was working for them, and he worked as a janitor for a long time. We could go back. Well, let's have something to look at while we're chatting about this.
Did he put any kind of mark on his work so that you?
No.
I didn't think so.
No. But like, this is actually, I don't know if you can see this here. This is a nurse that he worked with at the women's hospital, whom he hated. So he carved this statue of her naked and then stuck it in his yard. So I do think he may have just intended for that one to slowly disintegrate. Ma'am.
This says for sale. Where is that?
That,
Where is this?
so this, right, this is in his backyard. And his backyard, so if you're looking at
What's the date for this, do you think?
probably like 37, 38. But this was, from people I've talked to who lived in Edge Hill, everybody knew about this. Like this was something, no matter your race, you wanted to come by and look at the stuff. And I know, like I heard his niece talking, and they used to play in here all the time as kids. And then he had, you can kind of see in the back here, he had a big orchard. Like this was a sizable lot, would probably stretched like most of the width of a city block. So he had a house that he owned, that he bought, I think, with his railroad money. Then this area with his workshop, and then fruit trees and stuff back behind that. So he was, he was a homeowner, so he was pretty well established. And like I said, one of the interesting things to me, and it's something that I found repeatedly in my research, is that Black families in the South that thrived after the Civil War thrived because they stuck together. So if you look at a map, and were to map out, like I said, like he and his sister lived in a house together. Orange lived right behind them. Richard lived around the corner. Like they stuck together as a community, and also other people from the plantations where they'd been enslaved also came into Edge Hill and lived near them. So they were not alone trying to like navigate the city. And the other thing that's really interesting, and I think shows the importance of Fort Negley to the Edmondson experience, is many Edmondson men were stonemasons. So that became a job because of the experience that their dads and uncles and grandfathers had here at the fort. That became a family trade that they then, ma'am, in the back.
Can you read the sign for us? I can read for sale, but I can't make
Right.
out the rest.
It says for sale. Man, I can't make that up. Yes, carved ornaments, stoneware, but I can't make out what the yeah. Oh, I think it is, yeah.
William Edmondson.
Yeah.
WM.
Yeah.
William Edmondson. Thank you.
With the way, with all our internet connections now, somebody should be, there are people all over the United States that may have one of these.
Yep.
Oh, in fact,
You need to find out about it.
this, I think it was just like a year or two ago, an art critic from the New York Times was wandering around St. Louis and walked by a house and was like, oh my God, that's an Edmondson on that porch. And went and knocked on the door, and the people were like, yeah, our dad brought that back from Nashville one time. And he was like, okay, well, we need to get it out of the weather. And then the artist Cause bought it, and he helped, I think, a museum in New Jersey now has it.
What other museums have his works that you're aware of?
Right. Well, weirdly, so this museum in New Jersey, whose name is escaping me, I believe MoMA has at least one in their permanent collection. The Smithsonian has a couple. Milwaukee. Weirdly, and maybe you know better than I do, but does Williamsburg?
I don't know.
So there are some, like, and then of course, like over in Knoxville. But I will say, like, the catalogs that Cheekwood has put out has a lot of information about where stuff is held. But I'll say, you know, considering that this was his hobby as he was retired, probably there are a ton in Nashville and people just don't know what they have.
Yeah.
That
Well,
would-
that last one that Cheekwood acquired in, what, 2019 or
Mhm.
something, Mary and Maud,
right,
I mean, that came from a backyard.
right,
Some family, they donated it to, or gave it to Cheekwood. And it came with all the moss and everything on it. And so they had it in that last exhibit, and they were not real clear. They didn't clean up the moss because they wanted to do a lot of investigation.
Oh, good,
as to
yeah,
what
right.
that was going to do to that. But that had just been out in the backyard. The lady that had died and it was donated, it was bought when she was a little child.
right, yeah, yeah. And I have to think that that's probably very true for a lot of families in Nashville. So if your family has been here 100 years, go poke around in your attic. Sir?
There's a marker or of some sort on Charlotte for memorializing Edmondson. Is that site related to his actual life?
Weirdly enough, no. And which is, I mean, I'm very glad that there is a park devoted to Edmondson. I am also very glad that it is full of sculpture, so artists, you know, have been supported. But no, it doesn't have anything to do with Edmondson. He, as far as I can tell, never even really hung out over on that side of town. And there's nothing of Edmondson's in there, which if you look at his sculptures, like, you know, imagine if they had done a replica of that lion, but like large enough for kids to climb on. Like, these are very tactile. Like, they've got soft edges and like, you just want to touch them. And I just think it's such a shame that we didn't take that moment to kind of make that park a place that would introduce Edmondson to future generations of Nashvillians.
Didn't there used to be something there that was either his or a replica?
I don't know.
They proposed it, but I don't think it ever came to be. There was a proposal that went around that they were gonna do big replicas in poured concrete, but people said it was gonna be too dangerous, and then they scrapped it.
Yeah, I thought something was there
Well,
and they
park
had to
was-
take it away.
Where is
because-
that place?
The park was done by MDHA to try and clean up the area between Charlotte and the housing project.
Right.
that's there.
Right.
And they consciously tried to do sculptural things, as you know.
Yeah.
I think there was talk about doing a Edmondson tribute piece, and there is something there that looks, it's got kind of a rough hue look to it, so that's what
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah.
But again, where is that park?
It's on Charlotte, kind of across from the Jack Cawthorn's barbecue.
It'll be 17, between
Yeah.
16 and 17.
Yes, yeah. The other really interesting thing about,
It's a long strip.
yeah, and that part of town also used to be a stone quarry. So if you look at the housing project, like if you drive, like, I don't know what, but like off of Charlotte into the housing projects, you will go up those terraces, and that is from the old stone quarry. That quarry is actually the stone that made the state capitol. It was owned by one of the Robertsons.
Which is, part of that's on Cheekwood too.
Yeah.
And the prison was near there.
Yes, yeah.
16th and 17th.
When he died, this was all in his backyard? What happened to it?
Well, so this is kind of also one of those disasters of history, because he never married, he didn't have any children. So, and his family, as you can imagine, was incredibly overwhelmed by this yard. So they just told people to come get it. So a lot of it was just either taken away, or I am positive a lot of it just ended up in the trash. And a really sad result of that, and I know there's, at least some bruised feelings in the family about this, is that the Edmondson family themselves have not benefited in any way from the wealth created by Edmondson art. So that's, you know, I mean, again, it's just part of the reality of being a poor person in Nashville. You know, I'm sure that they thought of him, even, I mean, he was deeply loved. Please don't get me wrong, like his family just deeply loved him, and he seems to have been an incredibly nifty guy. But you know, if you're looking at this and your loved one has just died and you realize you got to get rid of a house, you got to figure out what to do with this junk, you know, like, I'm sure that they just felt overwhelmed, and there wasn't somebody to guide them to come in and say like, hey, this might be really, really valuable. You should hold on to it. All they saw was, this is going to be a lot of time and money to clean up, so if somebody wants it, come get it.
What were some of the prices?
Oh, at this point, I mean, not much. Like just, yeah. Yeah.
Well, you wonder, when did the value in his work come to be recognized?
Right.
It may not have been right at the
Oh, no, I mean, right, exactly. Yeah, but even after his exhibit at MoMA, it was, I don't think it really started to skyrocket in value until the 70s. That was kind of the first big bump. Then when Cheekwood had their first big exhibit, that was another big bump. And then what's happened now, I mean, I genuinely think it's kind of a result of like that modern artists love him. So they have made him collectible. But, you know, I mean, this is just obviously like always a problem with artists, right? Like, you don't and also like when you think about the fact that he had people like Louise Allwolf and the Stars and even Hirsch, right? Like, they had a lot of motivation to swoop in and buy that stuff cheap and then hold on to it because they knew what the MoMA show meant. And most people in Nashville, especially black people in Edmondson's neighborhood, like the idea of art speculation just would not have even been on their radar, whereas those guys had time and money and they knew the system. So it was very, you know, which I think is the other reason, is that even if these white folks had come in and advised the family, I think the family would have been like, well, yeah, but you're kind of using us. You know, like there's just a lot of space for distrust there. But it is also still, you know, I mean, I know with the Lanham headstone, just what I've looked into in that family, even if at the low end, like the cheapest that Edmondson has gone for recently is $100,000. I mean, that puts a kid through school, you know? That pays a medical bill, that settles a mortgage. Like, that is life-changing money for the Lanham family. And I doubt that they even know what they have. And then, I mean, could you imagine, like, trying to get all those great-great-great-grandchildren to all agree on like one course of action for that piece of art? So that's also, I mean, there have been many times when we've been in a cemetery and we've seen something face down. We've lifted it up, verified that it was an Edmondson, and then looked at each other and been like, well, what do we do? And we're like, well, the carvings are actually being protected by the dirt. Yep. So we put it right back down. But you know, but it does feel really unsatisfactory because it's like, these are incredibly valuable things. And, you know, and like in the 70s with the first big push, there was a lot of hard feelings were generated then because in the 70s, a lot of these headstones still had the critters on them. And after white collectors came through to protect the Edmondsons, they disappeared. But only those white collectors who had come to town knew the value of the critters sitting on the headstones. So it's really obvious who came and took them.
Betsy, could you tell the group a little about the range of books that are planned over the next several years to the 250th anniversary?
Sure.
Particularly the lies.
Yes, right. So this is a great thing to bring up in a history group. I am in charge of a series at Vanderbilt University Press called Truths, Lies, and Histories of Nashville. Got a little waylaid by COVID, but we're getting back on the horse. But the point is to have brief, engaging, conversations about history. So, because one of the things that I've noticed in doing my own research is that there's stuff that Nashville does not know, and that we have been told is unknowable, that scholars know so well. Let me give you an example. Okay, so Black Bob Renfro was the first black tavern owner in Nashville, and he was, weirdly enough, considering Andrew Jackson, friends with Andrew Jackson. They were close enough friends that Andrew was Bob's lawyer while Bob was enslaved. Who knows how that worked? But Jackson got Bob's owner to free Bob. And then Jackson helped Bob start the tavern. And then Bob would have to go after people to get them to pay their bills. And Jackson would help him, which is banana pants, right? Okay, so Bob comes to Nashville because he is on the Donaldson flotilla with the white Renfro family. They get off at Red River, when there was the big split up where half of the flotilla was like, we don't believe this is ever ending, we're just gonna get off here, hope y'all don't die. And it's like, but we were right, it's right there. Why didn't you quit at Muscle Shoals or something, to get this close and then just be like, no, we're done. But anyway, so he was enslaved by the Renfro family. So they settle out along the Red River, outside of Clarksville, not quite in Port Royal. And the family is attacked by Indians, and everyone except for the white Mrs. Renfro and Bob are killed. And so the white Mrs. Renfro and Bob scramble through, what is now Cheatham County into Davidson County, and they finally arrive safely in Nashville. And then she has to sell Bob to the owner that Jackson didn't like. But I always thought this was a weird story because if you think of what we're told about Native Americans in Middle Tennessee, first we're told there weren't any here, right? This was just a pristine wilderness for hunting, and the Cherokee lived to the east, and the Creek lived to the south, and no one lived here. So I was like, well, if no one lived here, who killed the Renfros? Right? No one can tell me. For years, I'm just like, because think about this, right? There aren't cell phones. There are not security cameras. And this is a small family out in the middle of nowhere. It's not like there wasn't the bat signal to all of a sudden tell Native Americans hey, way out there in the wilderness. How did they even find this family to kill them since they didn't live in the area? No sense. So I'm up at Port Royal, and I mentioned this to one of the park rangers, and he rattles off the names of the Indians. I was like, I'm sorry, sir, what? Because I've been told, we can't possibly know. It's this big mystery. And he's like, no. And I forget the names that he told me. It was these three guys, and they were Cherokee. Well, they were Chickamauga, and they had been asked by some Shawnee friends / relatives to come help with a massacre up in southern Illinois. So they had gone up there for this planned massacre. It had been a great success. And so, feeling battle hardened and real proud of themselves, they were coming back down to Chattanooga, and they see smoke from a chimney. And they're like, we did it once, let's do it again. And they like, I was like, how is it possible that we, history buffs, right? People who love history, and we all have been told like, well, this can't be known. This is just a big mystery. We have all these scholars who are like, oh yeah, that was Bob or whoever, you know? So I thought, wow, this is really something that would be useful to Nashvillians to have like just a series of books that were really engaged with history, but really tried to get at like what the actual truth is. Like what really happened? What do scholars know that we don't know? And can they tell us it in an entertaining way? That being said, I will say that I'm having a little spat with the Edmondson Society, so it's maybe not going well. It's going entertainingly. So our first book was called Mastodons to Mississippians. It's a look at the first 15,000 years of Nashville. I call it a history of the cities before the city. It's great.
It's brilliant.
Yeah, it's really great.
They have it here?
I don't know.
He spoke here.
Yeah, he did speak here. Yeah, I'm sure Aaron
No, I'm
came.
talking about, do they have a copy of it?
Oh.
They sell lots of books.
Yeah, I don't know. And then the second book that's out is on Timothy Edmondson.
And I have read that, and I don't see anything that hasn't been said about him. However, the author had to decline to speak to us because she was afraid the family was going to show up here and create a problem.
Right, but she will be speaking at the State Museum on, I believe, May 11th. So we shall, knock on wood, we shall see how that goes.
May 11th, go to the State Museum.
Yeah, but yeah, obviously I wouldn't have published it if I didn't think it was great. And then we have a lot of stuff in the works, but we're about to open back up for proposals. We're looking for things between 10,000 and 30,000 words. Like I said, something that we think is known about Nashville, but like real experts are like, well, it wasn't quite like that. Has Betsy Thorpe come to talk to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
So Betsy Thorpe is working on, it's going to be great, on a book for the series about this enslaved man named Jacob who was tried for murder. And this actually ended up being this case still has legal implications in Tennessee because it established, in law, what it took to be considered a person. Right? Because how do you try an enslaved person for murder? Because they're not legal people. So it's really fascinating. And she found out, weirdly enough, that the murder happened during the Whig convention. And that is actually how Jacob was able to make his escape. He could blend in with the Whigs and then vanish. So just a lot of cool stuff. Brandon Bird is working on a book on the Black Moses. Angela, do you know who I mean? I'm blanking on his name. But he took a bunch of people. He was like a benevolent cult leader. He took a bunch of Black people out to Oklahoma and Kansas and started a bunch of utopias. But they couldn't, once they got out. No, not Marcus Garvey. No, I can't think.
Was he the Black Moses?
Well, he was also called the Black Moses. He is the more famous Black Moses, but this is a guy from Nashville. But yeah, they wrote songs about him and then decided okay, your cult was fun, but we're just gonna have a village now. So he was kind of he was a defeated utopianist. So stuff like that, just little stories about Nashville, or maybe, things we wish people had more of an idea about. I'm trying to get, Jeff Sellers at the State Museum. He's been looking for the body of Judge Haywood. So Haywood was Nashville's first historian, basically. And his body is somewhat lost. Somewhat lost. So Jeff has been trying to locate it, and I want him to. Oh yeah, thank you guys. I'm sorry, I could babble on forever. But yeah, so Jeff's been looking for the body, and then I'm trying to get him to write kind of the final book in the series, because I think that'll bring it full circle to have a book about the first historian of Nashville written for Nashville's 250th anniversary. Because a lot of the myths that we have about Nashville are from Haywood. They come from him, just stuff that he was like, let me fix this story a little bit, make it more interesting.
Before people leave, I thought I'd mention there is a group working on an Edmondson Park on his property.
Oh, great. Yes, that's right. Mark. I can't think of it. Yeah.
They have fundraising events a couple of times a year over there by the HL Library.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also wondering if his orchard is where that community garden is now.
That would be really neat. But this is one of the reasons I had talked about trying to figure out how to get ground penetrating radar in there. Because as far as they know, there was nothing, like there was Edmondson's house, and now there's the basketball court. So it'd be really interesting to know what's in the ground there.
And they're going to try to transform Merle School into an art center.
Yeah, which they have big ideas.
And the tree that you mentioned is marked.
Yes.
That was
Yeah.
in his yard.
Yeah.
In his front.
Yeah, I would just highly recommend like scooting over on your way home and taking a look. It's just really cool that we're right here.
And where is that again?
It's 1434 14th Avenue. So it's by the Merle School. It's basically where their basketball court is.
Thank you so much for sharing all this with us.